Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar on the National Complete Streets Coalition's brand new grading policy framework, known as the elements of a complete streets policy. My name is Nimotolai Aziz. I'm a program associate here at the National Complete Streets Coalition. At the end of October, we publicly announced that our steering committee voted to approve a new framework for grading policies. This came after months of working with a policy task force of transportation professionals, planners, engineers, lots of meetings, calls, and revisions, all to increase the actual implementation of complete streets to benefit everyone who uses the streets, regardless of how they choose to travel. During the month of November, we published 10 blog posts revealing the new policy elements and also highlighting revisions to existing policies. For instance, vision and intent that was previously just vision alone, and an all-new element, diverse users, where we heard from our steering committee members at the National Association of Realtors and the American Heart Association's Voices for Healthy Kids. But we'll dive deeper into all the elements a little bit later. We received a lot of positive feedback all month long in response to the announcement of the new framework. America Walks, also on our steering committee, talked about the importance of tracking progress and success in complete streets policies through performance measures. And we also heard some complete streets puns around the importance of road design, concrete changes, for real. We also opened the nomination process this month for the Best Complete Streets initiatives. As you see here, Indiana Complete Streets doing a shout out to add examples to the nominations. Again, a special thank you to our steering committee members for assisting with Complete Streets Month. The entire policy framework is now available. If you did not receive the pre-meeting email with the link, we will send the framework, a copy of slides, and a recording after the webinar. Just a quick overview of today's webinar. We'll dive a little bit into who we are as the National Complete Streets Coalition. We'll review all of the updated policy frameworks and the scoring, and we'll also have time at the end for a question and answer. There's a chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Feel free to use that to ask questions at any time, and we'll try to address as many as we can at the end of the webinar. And if not, we will also be addressing any additional questions following the webinar. And with that being said, I'd like to turn it over to Emiko Atherton.
Thanks, Nimotolai, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the United States and beyond. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Emiko Atherton, and as I serve as the Director for the National Complete Streets Coalition, which is a program of Smart Growth America. I am so excited to be here today announcing the new ideal elements of our new framework, which really prioritize implementation and equity within complete streets. As Nimotolai says, this is a culmination of 2 years of work by the steering committee and staff and Smart Growth America to really push the envelope and raise the bar on complete streets policies in the United States. We'll be going over each element in detail, but before we do that, I wanted to introduce my co-presenter, Mike Rutowski. Mike Rutowski serves as the principal and oversees the complete street practice for Stantec Consulting. He is an engineer and planner, but I know him mostly as a complete street steering committee member who helped with this policy framework and who will be sharing some of the details as well. Mike, can you introduce yourself for us?
I think you did a great job, Emiko, but thank you and Nemo for setting this up. Again, Mike Rutkowski, based out of Raleigh and working for Stantec on this, and it's been a wonderful collaboration with the coalition and Smart Growth America to kind of move this effort forward, and really we tend to highlight and celebrate the policy, but over the past couple of years we've been focusing on the equity issue as well as implementation, and as an engineer, we love seeing things built. So kudos to the coalition and all of you folks joining us on the phone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. With that, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the National Complete Streets Coalition. I think most of you are familiar with us. But we, kind of how we arrived at where we are today. So the National Complete Streets Coalition, which is a very diverse coalition, and you can see this here in our steering committee members on the slide, created the Complete Streets movement. And this was back in 2004, 2005. It's really a way to change all aspects of the transportation process, to start to consider what we called at the time all users of all abilities. What that ended up translating to is really a movement that probably each one of you on the phone has been a part of. It also meant 1,300 complete streets policies in the country. We are so excited at kind of where complete streets are. As the coalition, and Motolai mentioned, we've been really thinking about how we translate all 1,300 of those policies into implementation and make sure that we're prioritizing the most vulnerable road users and pedestrians and bicyclists and walkers and cyclists and people living with disabilities and children and older adults into the transportation planning process. This has really been a process that's been led by the steering committee, and you can see based on the slide in front of you some of the partners that were involved in this update to the new framework. You can see this represents a wide variety of interests: AARP, America Walks, the American Public Health Association, the American Heart Association's Voices for Healthy Kids campaign, to name a few. We have members of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and I want to thank each one of them for really driving this and serving as the leadership. What you don't see on the slide is also many organizations that were critical in helping us update the policy and that were involved. The Safe Routes to School National Partnership, for example. We had a representative from the city of Seattle, Change Lab Solutions out of the Bay Area in California, just to name a few of the other groups that really helped do this. And so as we talk about the new framework today, I'm going to make really clear this is not just a staff-driven update, but really something, the vision set by all the members of the steering committee and then the policy task force moving towards. Really, we worked with people who are actually out in the field doing this every day. And with that, so how does this fit into our strategic direction at the coalition? We have been really focusing on moving policies into practice. And we've been doing this really in two ways, focusing all of our programs really with a lens of equity and a lens of implementation. So how do we make sure that the technical assistance that we do, the reports and research that we put out, and really the model policies that we've directed prioritize these two areas. I think any of you who have worked on a complete streets policy know that there are ideal elements, and what we realized as we looked at this after we adopted the strategic plan, that we really needed to codify in our own way implementation and equity. We've done this through our webinar series. We've done this through our last Dangerous by Design that really identified that people of color and older adults are most disproportionately impacted by pedestrian fatalities. We did this in our last Best Complete Streets Policies report, where we actually started to look at the characteristics of the communities that were adopting the Best Complete Streets policies. And I think it's really culminating today in this new framework. Again, it ultimately supports kind of the complete streets approach to delivering complete communities. I see policies as really the bedrock of what we do at the coalition to set the framework to then develop the practice through process level work within a DOT, really realizing the policy that translates into better projects that serve the most vulnerable users, which ultimately contribute to complete communities. So the coalition, as many of you are familiar with, tracks and keeps an inventory and an atlas map of all complete streets policies across the United States. And we've been doing this each year since 2011. We've been producing a report called the Best Complete Streets Policies Report that evaluates all policies based on our evaluation framework, otherwise known as the grading rubrics, that highlights these 10 ideal elements of a policy. Both the report and the framework are resources used by jurisdictions of all sizes. That means cities, metropolitan planning organizations, states, counties, departments of transportation, mayor's offices, to help them really develop strong policies. And this framework is the exact document we'll be discussing with you today. And you can see we'll be sharing afterwards this new evaluation framework online. So since we started tracking the policies, we've seen a significant increase in the number of policies. And so looking at the graph before you, you can see that there were 100 policies passed in 2005. I think it was actually a little bit, it was around 31. My notes are, I think we had about 31 to 35 complete streets policies in 2005. And in 2017, we are on track to hit 1,300 complete streets policies. We, I believe, are at 1,280. So we expect to hit 1,300 by the end of the year. I'd also like to note that in addition to seeing an increase in the number of policies, we've seen an increase in policy scores. And really the policy scores reflect the quality of the policy based on the ideal elements. So back in 2006, when we looked at the policies, the median score for a policy was 34, and that's 34 out of 100. In 2015, the median score jumped to 68, and then the latest year it jumped to 80. And while we think this is wonderful that people are not only passing more complete streets policies, but better complete streets policies, it's really, we saw this as an opportunity to also raise the bar. And it speaks to the idea of what made a strong policy at the beginning of the decade is not the same as what's needed today. When we started the Complete Streets Coalition, we really wanted communities to get excited and just pass policies. What we've learned after a decade is, the movement has taken hold, and now we need to elevate all of the policies in the country to actually having more teeth and to be more specific about what a community is going to do to translate their complete streets policy into practice. So we'll get more into that now as we discuss our new and revised elements of a complete streets policy framework. So in front of you, you see the original ideal elements, and those hits on the idea of vision. A community really needs to have a strong vision of what they want from their community, not just from their streets, that they would address all users and modes, things like exceptions and exceptions process if someone wasn't going to do a complete streets project, making sure that communities are using the best and latest design standards, that they're really developing complete streets that are context sensitive or sensitive to the community that they surround. They're measuring the performance, and they're making a commitment to implementation. Now, the new revised elements of a complete streets policy look like this is our track changes version of what it looks like. So here in the blue, you will see the new additions, or I'd say the track changes edit to the framework for change. So again, after months of reflecting on how the policies were graded and revising the language for the Coalition Steering Committee, we voted, the Steering Committee, which Mike is a member of, voted in September to approve this framework. Not only does it raise the bar, but it calls for more requirements and accountability as well as more opportunities to integrate equity, something that really wasn't present in the previous policies. So here is another way to look at it. So you can see that vision and intent is emphasized throughout all policies as a priority, and most of the element point structure changed from including points for binding action. And what does that mean? I was talking to somebody earlier today about really what this intention means. And where I'm from in Washington State, we have a couple different ways at the local level you can pass a policy, but one of them would be a resolution. And I tend to think of resolutions as, you might think of a New Year's resolution that you will resolve. Every year I resolve to floss my teeth more, and you can ask my dentist whether that has happened or not. Or you can actually have a binding ordinance. And what we felt was really, really important is that all these actions needed to be more binding. So not only in the first element does a community need to set a strong vision, but we're really encouraging and awarding more points for a binding ordinance. But then this is reflected throughout each of the other 10 elements. Equity in complete streets also means investing in the most underserved communities, when what we know in the United States is often the most underserved communities are communities of color and poor communities. And really to involve the people who have been systematically excluded from the transportation planning process, and prioritizing projects that serve the most vulnerable users that really just serve those that have that are not only being disproportionately represented in injuries and fatalities, but also have the least amount of really good infrastructure. And I'm talking about basic things like sidewalks, street lighting, bike lanes, crosswalks, signalized crosswalks. And so this is now seen in the framework of something jurisdictions are required to do and include when making decisions required to implementing complete streets. So I'm going to go through the first 5 in detail and then turn it over to Mike. So the first updated one that used to just be vision is now called a vision and intent, which really says the vision should acknowledge the importance of how complete streets contribute to building a comprehensive transportation network. So what does that really mean? So complete streets policies work because each policy reflects the community's own vision. While each policy calls for a commitment to diverse users and abilities, communities are able to articulate their own unique visions, whether that be an economic vision, an equity vision, a sustainability, a health vision, a safety, or a livable future for their people and their place. This updated vision guidance also encourages communities to build transportation systems that really create networks of opportunity for people to access their work, their place of worship, school, healthcare, friends, family, and food in whatever way they need or want to travel. And by that I mean not just developing one complete street project, but really this is about building networks that regardless of who you are or how you need or want to travel, you can get to from point A to point B in a safe, reliable, affordable, convenient way in a reasonable amount of travel time. And really this is at the core of a complete streets approach. And again, as I said, ultimately we're asking communities and encouraging them to make strong commitments to complete streets by passing binding policies. This is, and you'll see, we'll share this afterwards, but a binding policy and this vision and intent is given 12 points within the entire framework, and we're awarding points now for clear, intentional language around modes and networks, and really the motivations for why a community is adopting complete streets in the first place, and we are giving points for communities that specifically identify equity as a motivation in adopting their complete streets policy. The next element, which used to be called all users and modes, is now called diverse users, which says complete streets are intended to benefit all users equitably, but particularly users and particularly vulnerable users and the most underinvested and underserved communities. This new element holds jurisdictions accountable for including equity into their plans based on their own unique composition and objectives, and recognizing that the U.S. has a history of systematic discrimination and inclusion as part of its transportation context and history, and that really we can't ignore that. This element is intended to make communities think about who in their communities is the most vulnerable. So we don't specifically call that out, but we ask them to go through that work to figure out who is most vulnerable, who is the most underinvested in terms of infrastructure, and then to really prioritize people, those communities and those individuals throughout their complete streets implementation work. This next one is called projects and phases, so the name stayed the same, but this policy should specify the need to provide accommodations for all modes of transportation in the construction and repair that impacts all users of the roadway network. So what does this mean? So we've always said that we need to integrate complete streets into all aspects of the transportation planning process, and that goes from funding to scoping to design to actually final design, construction, operation, and maintenance. We're continuing with that, but we're also saying that I know many challenges happen in communities during construction or repairs, and so we're saying that a community needs to have a strong policy around construction mitigation for pedestrians and bicyclists and people living with disabilities, because I know in my hometown right now of Washington, D.C., that is a huge problem. We happen to be around the corner from a development that has been going on, I think, maybe since I started my work at Smart Growth America a little over 2 years ago, and the protected bike lane disappeared. And what it's done is it's really put cyclists vulnerable as they have to merge into the traffic lane. So we're saying, you need to make those accommodations. You need to think about, where you put things like signage, because if I might be fully mobile and I reach that, I can easily cross the street. But are we making that? We're making full accommodations for people living with physical disabilities. Are we really thinking through that? The next element is called clear, accountable exceptions, and that we're really saying that and this has been around since the beginning, that the policy language should clearly define a process for granting exceptions to a complete streets policy, but we're adding also that there are requirements for public notice. What's been really interesting is that we've discovered one of the larger barriers to complete streets is that a community may have a very good policy, but either the jurisdiction or the elected officials of the jurisdiction are willing to accept a lot of, get exemptions to a lot of projects to actually do complete streets work. What we're saying is that the process needs to be more clearly defined, and that there needs to be some public notice of this going on, so that this isn't all happening behind closed doors. And then the fifth element, which is jurisdiction, is that we recognize that many agencies control our streets. And for a user, we don't really understand when we're crossing between jurisdictions. And often within, say, one city, you might have the city-owned part of the roadway network, but also the state highway department. So really, we want to create complete streets networks that can be achieved by coordination between governments, departments, neighboring jurisdictions, and private developers. So we are encouraging the requirement of private agencies and private developers to comply with the complete streets process through the permitting and approval process. We also want to see the partnership of cities or jurisdictions working with other jurisdictions through funding opportunities. And we also are really asking the departments, the typical departments that have overseen transportation, like the Department of Transportation, the Department of Planning, and the Department of Public Works, to start to reach out to other partners within their own jurisdiction or region, such as the Department of Health, the Department of Housing, looking at the City Council and the Mayor's Office. I think there's a lot of opportunities to collaborate with the affordable housing and public health disciplines, community development, and so we are asking communities to do that. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike at this point.
Thank you, Emiko. As a design or as an engineer, we love to solve problems. We love to build stuff. So our remaining 5 elements are really focused on design and performance measures and implementation. So with that in mind, you really sit back and think about it. 95% of the complete streets that we're seeing on the road and that people are working on, jurisdictions and states, are really retrofitting a bad idea, retrofitting a problem corridor. It could be safety, it could be congestion, it could be economic viability issue where it's stagnant. And so, but again, we're retrofitting older streets. So design element is all about that. We want to give credit to those folks in terms of the policy framework, those jurisdictions, the need to create and update their own existing design guidance and or design standards. If you think about it, the way roads are designed can influence traffic speed, safety, its comfort, quality of service, if you will, and many other factors that affect people and the people that use the street itself. So points are provided to those jurisdictions that that really identify those specific guidance that they'll adopt or they'll endorse. And there's many products that are on the web and available to us. Lots of good resources. We all know about NACTO, which does a really good job of understanding in a visual aspect of how to integrate design standards relative to intersection treatments or unique bicycle pedestrian facility types and show those on a dimension-by-dimension standpoint. There's other great documents as well, including ITE does a great job. Designing Walkable Urban and Thoroughfares, I think that's one of my favorites. It really blends the context-sensitive approach to walkability And another one I'll just highlight here, there's many to choose from, but another brought to you by ICE as well, and that's the safety aspect, integrating safety in the project development process and beyond. Great tools, great resources. You don't have to reinvent the wheel for this. Next. Folks, you're going to have to change the slide for me. There you go. All kidding aside, back up for one, but what we really want to focus on, those design elements, once we nail down, it's a great example, Six Forks Road in North Carolina, really was in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's really labeled the Main Street of Midtown for Raleigh, North Carolina, and it goes right through suburban America, which seems to be a lot of the focus on the complete streets nowadays. In the Six Forks study, it used more of a context-sensitive planning process to integrate bicycle and pedestrian and transit amenities and provisions, while at the same time managing safety issues and traffic mobility. And so those design manuals are really essential in looking at how we retrofit, how we treat that median zone, how we treat the bicycle pedestrian interface, and of course the built realm, the interaction between the building frontage and the bicycle pedestrian amenities. Next. Yeah, and one more. All right. So land use, it's kind of ironic. They ask an engineer to talk about land use and development. But again, we need to look holistically no matter what your title, no matter what your background education is. In this case, land use and context-sensitive solutions is really important. This has changed simply from the previous policy from context sensitivity to really integrating the built realm, if you will. Simply mentioning it, in an old policy just doesn't do the trick anymore. So an effective policy, it should be sensitive to the surrounding community, the built environment, and really included the current and planning of buildings, parks, and trails, as well as current and expected transportation needs. So integrating it into your comp planning, your growth strategy is really, really important. The background on this image here really shows the interface between the street and the activity on the street, the mobility and choices for all modes, and balances it against the built realm or the urban design characteristics. And again, as engineers, as planners, as urban designers, we care more about the first 10 feet, if you will, the interface between the development frontage and the interaction with what's happening, or the action along that street, much like this illustration is illustrating here. Really, how does that parlay and how does that interact and really determine the functionality and design characteristics of that corridor? Everything from outside seating to shade trees, pedestrian level lighting, parking, and the interaction of whatever happens on the retail side. Next. Next thing we want to talk about are performance measures. And again, this is kind of reiterating what was on the previous policy, and that is everything to do with what the vision, I think Emiko alluded to it in the first key element there, the vision. This is really the next step. Everybody has a comp plan. Everybody has potentially, hopefully, has some sort of mobility plan, whether it's a comprehensive transportation plan for a county or city, or whether it's an LRTP, long-range transportation plan for an MPO, or growth strategy or the like, or mobility plan specific to bicycle pedestrian interconnectivity. And time and time again, we always are faced with, well, how do we measure success? And so those performance measures, we need a good direct correlation when we look at this new framework and our policy for complete streets. What is that connection going to be with those adopted vision plans, if you will? Designed kind of comprehensively to measure the impact of complete streets policy. Now, the revised framework requires measures to expand beyond just the usual metrics. Metrics like number of lane miles, or bike lane miles, if you will. We're looking at other additional measures like access, like economic impacts, environmental, safety, even health. A lot of these measures are now today's off-the-shelf data can really help us to inform in terms of mobility, safety, equity, and health. We've got a lot of data that we can use now to really identify what those performance measures are and to measure them more effectively. A great example, next. Great example is Binghamton. Binghamton, New York, this is kind of their MPO. And the example, in this, the vision of this policy, we see that Binghamton, the study references how the policy will encourage economic growth, economic property values, reduce crashes or accidents, improve health and safety and fitness, as well as reduce harmful emissions. So kudos to them. And that's really, we don't want to go over the top, but we want to look at metrics a little bit differently than the standard, lane miles type of thing. Next. This parlays nicely into number 9, selection criteria. Let's face it, nothing's for free and everybody's vying. Each project competes against other projects and even other modes for receiving federal, state, and local dollars. Project selection criteria is just a response. It's new to the policy framework. It's a response to the change of times. 30 years ago, a lot of these decisions were made behind closed doors by elected officials. I could honestly say that out loud, but today we're more accountable and we're more measurable if you qualify that. So the criteria should be really measurable and develop weighted structure for active transportation infrastructure as well as access destinations. It's all about allocating the funding and what gets built. And today, there's a lot of metrics that are floating around there. We just need to qualify that in our framework, integrating complete streets and equity into the selection process. And this means a focus on underserved communities or alleviating the disparities between or regarding health or safety or even in economic development benefits. Last criteria is criteria 10, and that's the implementation step. And with this said, we want to kind of frame that one out, and we talked about these in its entirety throughout this presentation. But number 1, let's just kind of walk through that and talk about what it means. And the coalition kind of identified these 5 steps to ensure the policies really don't hit the shelf and collect dust. And so with that in mind, number 1, restructure and revise procedures and existing plans. These plans should be living documents, whether a bike peds specific to bike ped mobility or transit mobility, or whether it's a comprehensive plan or even a comprehensive transportation plan. They need to reflect these priorities for complete streets integration. And honestly, the performance measures need to reflect what's in those vision documents. Number 2, make use of design guidance. Design guidance, should be updated and reflect best design or planning practices in transportation design. Number 3, offer staff training. This is essential because Emiko and myself and Nemo and a number of other folks at the coalition do a lot of outreach, and a number of folks we see on the webinar as well have taken advantage of that. But not everybody speaks the same language, and not everybody understands what complete streets are. So we need to offer up those trainings to staff, to community leaders like elected officials, because let's face it, they're the decision makers. We need to convince them. If we can't convince them that complete streets are important, what are we doing to move this effort forward? And of course, the public and advocacy groups. Number 4, implementation advisory committees. And what we mean by that, we need to build advocacy. It could be a bike ped specialist. It could be, an advocacy group that wants to support better walkability or healthy lifestyles. It could be disadvantaged communities as well. So building those champions and incorporating them into your policy framework to make sure that we're moving this momentum forward and Complete Streets Initiative into implementation is the keys to our success. And last but not least, creating community engagement plan. Let's understand there's a lot of tools that we can use to effectively connect with people in different ways. Social media, interactive web pages, traveling road shows, board briefings, and the like. And finally, it's important for communities to kind of develop a community engagement plan that addresses not only public selection process, but the design and implementation process as well. The best policy will establish how the plan will address how to overcome these barriers, and the implementation process overall. And with that, Emiko?
Thank you so much, Mike, for going over all of that. So what does this mean for all of you on the call and all the communities that have Complete Streets policies? So we do plan on, because we want better policies, better plans, better practices, better projects, and ultimately complete communities. So beginning January 1st, we will start to review new Complete Streets policies based on this new framework. In the interim, we will still have a report come out around early March that will replace this year's it will replace the formerly known Best Complete Streets Policies report in the transition year, and we are calling it the Best Complete Streets Initiatives. We'll be highlighting some of the Best Complete Streets initiatives in the country. We will still grade policies that were adopted in 2017 based on the former framework, but we will not have a top 10 list this year. So there will be an appendix where you can still find a policy that was adopted in 2017 graded by the prior framework or ideal elements, unless you would like us to grade it under the new policy framework. But beginning any policies that are adopted after January 1st of 2018 will be evaluated under the 2018 or evaluated under the new framework. Now, I'm sure that there are a lot of questions how does this affect existing policies that were adopted in the past and got a good reward. So we won't go back and reassign grading unless you'd like us to. But we do encourage and hope that all communities will take this and see it as an opportunity to update their Complete Streets policies. The policies that we're going to highlight going forward are really going to be the policies that are adopted under this new framework. So again, we are hoping that the communities that have adopted policies before will go ahead and think about considering updating their policies. We are so excited for all of this. We're excited for all of you that took the time to attend this and that the feedback that we hear about moving towards implementation and equity. With that, I'll turn it back to Nimotolai before we turn to questions and answers.
Thank you, Emiko and Mike, for really sharing your expertise on the new policy framework. And also another thank you to the task force, who also poured a lot of their insight and experience into the new policy framework today. So aside from sending us your questions, and please do send them in, even if we do not have time to answer all of them today, we will compile all of the questions and then post as many answers as we can to make sure that the process for moving forward with policies is as clear as possible. As Emiko mentioned, you can, at this time and over the last month, nominate Best Complete Streets initiatives. So if you know of projects, plans, policies, people in your community, committees that have worked on Complete Streets, please take 5 minutes. The nomination form is very brief, and we really want to see all the good work that everyone is doing. Another thing that you can do, consider existing policies. And I've already seen a lot of questions come in about what this means for existing policies. And as Emiko mentioned, scores will stay the same, but definitely take time to consider the new framework and seeking areas for growth in policies. And as you may have heard, we have our second national conference in partnership with Transportation for America's Arts and Culture team this April in Nashville. So if you were really intrigued by this last discussion, this past hour, definitely consider attending the conference, as we'll be discussing Complete Streets as well as creative placemaking, and have a chance to really meet and network with practitioners from all over the country who are engaging in this work. Lastly, before we turn it over to questions, we will still grade all policies that have been adopted in 2017 using this previous framework. And again, we'll now turn it over to question and answer. And so the first question, and I'll open this to the presenters as well as any questions that I can answer, is who the points are awarded to in terms of this framework.
Well, if I think I understand the question, the points are awarded to the jurisdiction that has adopted the Complete Streets policy. That will really depend on, it will be on the adopting body. So if it's, say, a city government, it will be awarded to the city. If it's a metropolitan planning organization, it will be given to the MPO. If it's a department, we will give it to the department.
Thanks, Emiko. Another question that came in a little bit more specifically to the new framework is what elements of context sensitivity includes members of the community? And to expand on that a little bit, I would assume that context sensitivity, we've now added a requirement to include community context when making decisions. So for instance, if a Complete Streets project has the potential to involuntarily displace or change, change the current context of where people are living or how they get to place A from point A to point B, that needs to be considered at the onset in the Complete Streets policy. So when it comes time to make that decision, those members of the community will be informed as well as considered from the onset.
Right. I think Namotalai brings up a very good point, is that one of the things that we think about in the land use and context sensitivity is not only do we want to start, creating communities that are really unique to the projects that are unique to the community's character, but that places are not just about place, they're about the people, and that we need to recognize kind of their interests, but also their concerns. I know in the active transportation world, there's been a lot of concern about projects not reflecting the character of a current community or the unintended consequences of bringing investment into involuntary displacement. What we want communities to do, or the adopting jurisdiction, is to really specify their need, again, as Namotalai says, to mitigate this and to consider the community as a factor. And the community, I mean the people and not just the place, while doing their decision making. Next question.
Thanks, Emiko. So to broaden the scope a little bit, we received a question about how can we better tie Complete Streets projects to transit investments. And I'll open this up to the presenters as well.
Yeah, Mike, I'm going to turn that to you. So really, how would you recommend that we tie Complete Streets projects to transit investments?
Yeah, I wouldn't differentiate any more than any other mode, to be honest with you. When we go in and look at these projects, project by project, we want to balance all interests, right? And so when I look at, like a downtown or any kind of network, we want to look at everything holistically, right? And so every street has a different function and a different design aspect. And so some folks may be like main streets. You know that every main street's going to have a sidewalk or may have outside sidewalk for seating. Other streets may be mobility carriers that really focus on commuter and moving people and goods and services. Other streets yet can be multimodal, and some streets may be high priority transit corridors. So I would look at them street by street, but look at everything holistically in your network to understand how the street typology works together, and then hone in on the streets that you want to move forward in terms of complete streets or retrofit. And then everything has trade-offs. Once you prioritize those modes for each street, then you can identify trade-offs. And it could be trade-offs for transit, it could be trade-offs for bicycle pedestrian, or even the vehicle itself. And so I think that's the best way I hope I'm addressing that issue, but bottom line is you need to look at this holistically on a network basis to understand how all the streets work together, i.e. street typology. And then when you look at a street individually, you need to look at the competing interests, the priorities for different modes, and then you can identify trade-offs. And that's probably the best way to integrate specific amenities, provisions for transit on a specific corridor as well as through a network. Hope that helps.
Yeah, and I'm going to just add to that, Mike. I think that's a great answer. One of the things that, Complete Streets has historically dealt with the actual built environment, the infrastructure. but that all of us on the call know that people have to be on that infrastructure and people have to be on certain modes. When we talk about issues of equity, I think transit is very, very important because not only do we see lower car ownership in low-income communities and certain communities of color, but transit becomes really a lifeline to access to jobs, healthcare, social networks. And then from an environmental perspective, we're really encouraging the use of transit and alternative modes to get around. In the element that speaks to jurisdictions, I would encourage all of you to engage your transit agency more. The chair of the Complete Streets Coalition is actually the Director of Policy and Sustainability for the American Public Transit Association, because APTA, which represents all the major transportation systems in the country or agencies, really sees the importance of, transit is an incredible lifeline for people. Transit is also, transit is hugely important. I'd say making sure that transit is at the table when you're making your decisions is very important. Next question.
Thanks, Emiko. And that actually ties us over into our next question. We received a few questions about working with public works departments and receiving opposition when it comes to complete streets. And they are wanting to know how to engage public works and where does facilities and maintenance fall into the new policy framework?
I love this question, and I'll answer it and then turn it to you, Mike, if you want to fill in anything else. I think public works is such a critical, if your public works department is then actually overseen, in many jurisdictions, the public works department is actually the one overseeing transportation. But in jurisdictions where they are a partner, but not perhaps but there's actually Department of Transportation or Planning that's overseeing this, they're really important because they're actually, in a way, doing more on the road system than a planning or transportation department is. They're constantly out there doing operations and maintenance. There's a lot of opportunity to collaborate. One of my favorite stories around this is actually in a city outside of Orlando. It's a small, about 12,000 person suburb outside of Orlando, Florida, called Longwood. And in Longwood, there was a lot of leadership and excitement from the Department of Planning about complete streets, but the city has very limited capital funds to go out and do new projects. With that said, they noticed their public works department was going out there and doing a lot of basic kind of maintenance and operations. They were repaving roads, they were rebuilding sidewalks, and they said, well, we could do a lot of kind of smaller incremental changes like, striping a bike lane during a repaving project, or making sure that, we're doing a bulb out or extending the sidewalk at crosswalks through these public works projects. They approached the Public Works Department, who was open to that, and they now have monthly meetings where the planning department actually gets to have input and have conversations with the Department of Public Works on their asset management list or the projects they're out there and doing. Mike, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think there's another angle to that question as well. You hit it on the head, the low-hanging fruit, but oftentimes, and we've run the risk of this when we do our training, oftentimes we're confronting with, it's almost like the department's planning and designing in silos, right? And we just ran into this in the Chattanooga, we just ran into this in Birmingham and the like. And in Orlando, you have a planning department, you have your public works, you have your engineering, you have your PR, and you have your urban design center or whatever. And they're all doing their own thing in silos. So the key is it's institutional change. And we've hit a lot of old school kind of mentality, and honestly it has nothing to do with age. We've seen a lot of young folks that have been kind of programmed by their predecessors, their mentors, about this is the way we do business for so long. And so it's an institutional change which may have a lot to do with liability. Public Works is all about finding the regulatory or the design standards and following that for every project that they do. We understand that's how we have been trained so often. So I think it's a matter of education and busting down those silos and working in a collaborative environment. And so those engineers should sit side by side with planners, urban designers, landscape architects in a number of these projects in the life cycle of a project development stage, so that the public works, who's all really keenly interested in liability, if we do something that's different than what's in the Astro Design Manual or in the MUTCD, then we're up for liability. This is not the way to do it, And so we need to break that down and let them understand, hey, majority of these complete streets are what? They're retrofits. So there's always going to be, oftentimes, always going to be some sort of trade-offs, right? And maybe potentially design exceptions. So I think to help that, it's all about, number one, education and getting those folks in the same room as your planning department, as your long-range department, as your engineering, public works, and even urban design folks, and let them understand that this is the way we got to do business as we move forward. And that, to me, is the most important thing. So educating those folks and letting them know that there's a different way to do business when it comes to retrofitting these streets, and there's always going to be trade-offs. I know it's long-winded, but that's probably the best explanation I could provide.
Thanks. So our next question, we've had a few different angles come in through participants, some of whom are already on existing bike ped committees, and some who are looking to start advisory groups. And they would like to know, how can the National Complete Streets Coalition assist them in either developing these committees, advisory groups, and developing policies as well?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, first we'll start off, we have a lot of really great resources on our website that are available for free. If you haven't poked around, you can access it through www.smartgrowthamerica.org/complete streets. Does that sound right? I'm getting some nods in the room. I feel like an advertisement there. So with that, you'll find information about really how to develop a policy. We'll be releasing the new framework, kind of a local policy guidebook. If you are interested, I spend most of my time outside of DC working with communities to help them develop complete streets policies, build coalitions, and actually implement their policies. We've been doing this. If you're interested to learn more about this, looking at some of our blog posts, and we'll make sure to send that out also in our recap about work we're doing through our Safe Streets Academies and the Complete Streets Consortium series. But we also do individual technical assistance. If you're curious, please send me an email. We love working with communities around the country. I learned so much from all of you, and I'm able to kind of go ahead with the steering committee members and staff and others at Smart Growth America, share those best practices. Thanks, Emiko.
Other sets of questions that we've been getting in are around our new policy element on diverse users. The question reads that they're glad that all users change to consider diverse and vulnerable users, but is wondering how to getting feedback and really developing the town's policy and getting buy-in on what that really means and helping everyone in their town understand.
So the question is really how to go about developing or identifying who those diverse users are. So we really want a community to go through and start to look systematically at where some of the most disinvested places are. Sometimes you can just actually go through with a survey of sidewalks. What communities have sidewalks, which don't. Looking at your police department should have information about where people are being struck and killed and injured, whether on bike or by foot, and who those people are, kind of the demographics of them. So we want, and then to really go out and start to talk to communities about things that matter to them. So Nima, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll kind of tag along with what Emiko was saying earlier. We have a lot of resources on our website. We mentioned Dangerous by Design earlier, and really pointing out that this is a matter of livelihood for people and getting to where they need to go. But I think for some, the numbers may speak to the need for the infrastructure. And so having that data available and recent reports that came out is something that could be assisted. And then I think in that same question as well, there was questions around rural communities. Again, another resource that I would just like to point out is that the Federal Highway Administration and Alta Planning came out with a resource recently on small town networks and rural multimodal communities. And in that online at ruraldesignguide.com, there is resources, very visual resources that people have actually been able to take into meetings with their planning commissions and other boards, and physically be able to show them what they're talking about when it comes to complete streets.
And I would just add to that kind of an example of a community in our hometown here in Washington, D.C. that's done this, not through their complete streets policy, but actually through the Department of Transportation is, we talked about earlier doing maintenance and operations. This is otherwise known often as asset management, and many communities have asset management plans. When Washington, D.C. was redoing their asset management plan, the Chief of Staff of the District Department of Transportation asked for data on where they had been doing maintenance and operations and what was driving those decisions. And what they discovered is many of the basic sidewalk repairs, pothole repairs, bike lane restripings were happening in the higher income wards, which are like neighborhoods here in Washington, D.C. And that was because often it was the residents in these wealthier wards that knew how to navigate the political system, that had relationships with the city council members where they could get the city council members engaged. It's often known as the squeaky wheels. And so when they started to redo their asset management plan and how they operated, they made a conscious decision to start working within all wards. So, not only were the most going into wards 1 and 2, which are the higher income wards in D.C. and the whiter wards, but the least amount of maintenance and operations were going into wards 7 and 8, which have a majority black population and are some of the lowest income neighborhoods within D.C. So that's an example of what a community can do to actually actualize that. Okay, and with that, it looks like we're at time. It is 2 o'clock now. I know that we received an outstanding number of questions, and we want to make sure that we get to all of those. We'll be following up with a recap blog post that will have answers to many of the questions that you've asked today. We'll also be sharing later today a blog post that has the new policy framework in it. And I want to thank each one of you for joining us. I want to thank Mike in particular for spending time and being a member of the steering committee that's really pushed for this. And I'm going to ask Nemotali to close us out with any final thoughts.
Yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in, and to our presenters as well, Emiko and Mike. Like Emiko mentioned, if you have any other questions, we will be addressing them. So for instance, if you think of one later today when you're finishing up your lunch, definitely feel free to shoot us an email both today and in the future as we introduce this new policy framework. We'd be happy to discuss with you as well. And with that, I want to wish everyone a great afternoon and a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.